that's really what I'm trying to bring to EMDR for ADHD, is to say, let's help our clients swim as opposed to trying to force them to ride a bike or climb a tree while still using the core modality. Bilateral stimulation works for trauma processing for brains with ADHD. It works. I've done thousands of sessions and I have hundreds and hundreds of people who can say this really helped. But there's these tweaks that we can make to it, just the traditional standard protocol, that really increases effectiveness and also reduces the possibility of shaming our clients. So this is one of my biggest issues with traditional therapy these days. You know, there's a lot of homework, there's a lot of using certain skills at times of distress. And then when that doesn't happen, the client comes back and the therapist goes, well, how was being mindful this week? And they go, oh, I forgot to do it and I couldn't do it. And then they're like, well, that's bad. You're being resistant or you're failing therapy. No, they have ADHD.
Welcome to Successful with ADHD. I'm Brooke Schnittman. Let's get started.
Welcome back to another episode of Successful with ADHD. Today, I have a good friend and colleague that I highly respect and admire, Noelle Lynn, and she specializes in EMDR and ADHD. And not many people who do EMDR understand the nuances of people with ADHD and the visualizations. So, Noelle, please do yourself justice and share who you are.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me, Brooke. I really love talking to you. You're one of my favorite people to talk about ADHD with.
Same here.
Yeah. So Brooke and I met a couple of years ago at the big ADHD conference, which is always a really good time. It's coming up in November in Anaheim if anybody wants to come. We really connected just over our love of helping people with ADHD. So I've been in the field for almost 10 years now. I got my master's in social work after being a coach for a couple of years. And I now work specifically on the therapy side for ADHD. And I actually work at the ADHD Center of West Michigan, where we have a whole team of coaches as well as therapists. So we really do keep a distinction between the work that we do. And so my passion is really working at the therapy level with clients, which is much more addressing things like shame, negative core beliefs. And I do use EMDR a lot of the time to help with that. And we can talk more about what that is. But I love differential diagnosis. I love helping people to understand their brains and to stop shaming themselves for the brains that they have.
Sure. Noelle, you have a lot of knowledge. You know, if we were fast friends at the ADHD conference, two ADHDers, right, sharing love for each other. I watched you do a session on EMDR. I watched you talk about the nuances of bipolar, ADHD, and borderline personality, right? And how often that gets misdiagnosed.
Yes, especially in women. And we're also, this year, I'm adding autism to that same training and doing a 3-hour one, because what the newest research is showing is that misdiagnosis among basically neurodivergent, so ADHD plus autism or one or the other, is really what's driving the misdiagnosis drive of borderline personality disorder. And so when people don't understand neurodivergence and how those things can show up, they end up diagnosed with something like borderline, and it's often incorrect. I'm not saying it's always incorrect. There are absolutely people in the world who do have borderline personality disorder, but we've seen over the last 10, 20 years, this massive increase in women being diagnosed with it. And it's basically the new hysteria, right? Like it's this new thing to kind of undermine women. But those of us in the neurodivergent field are starting to say, wait a second, when you take trauma and put it together with ADHD and or autism, it ends up looking like this personality disorder, but what's underneath is actually a neurodivergent brain that's been traumatized.
Can you talk about, and obviously, you know, you need a mental health professional to diagnose you, but can you talk about the quick differences?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things I always talk about is history. So if people are looking at someone's life, and they're asking questions like, you know, when did you start seeing significant, you know, switches and changes in your behaviors and mood lability? Or how long have you been struggling with executive dysfunction? The challenge is that most people who are diagnosing seem to not know how to ask women the questions, right? Because basically women will present and will say, oh, of course I'm on time. And so then the assessor will say, doesn't struggle with time management. But did you ask her how she's on time? And I like to say she has, 10 whiteboards, 16 alarms, and her best friend calls her at noon every day to get her out the door on time, right? But if an assessor doesn't ask her, how are you on time? How exactly do you do that? How exactly does that happen in your life? You're never going to actually get to the executive dysfunction, because women are the executive function of society, at least in America. And so we figure out all of these ways to keep up with these things, but the amount of energy and effort that we're using to manage those dysfunctions, having, 10 alarms, a friend call us, 16 calendars, all of those things that are trying to keep us on track. Yes, we're on time, but at what cost?
Mm-hmm. All the anxiety and amygdala that is like firing to try to be everyone's executive functions, including our spouses, our children, our own. Yeah.
And so when we don't ask women, and we don't often ask women how they achieve these executive functioning tasks, we will then a lot of assessors will assume that they can achieve those tasks, or will then say, well, you must have borderline because sometimes you can do these things and sometimes you can't or won't.
Wow.
But really, they're struggling all the time. They just sometimes hit points, especially in our cycle or other times in our lives, where they don't have as much dopamine or support. And so they do lose track of those executive functions. But in borderline, you're looking for executive function issues specifically when you're in certain phases of having personality disorder. Mm-hmm. And so that's where it often gets conflated. And similarly with autism, there are executive dysfunctions in autism that are not well understood, right? And so again, it can have a little bit more of an inconsistent feel to executive dysfunction in autism. And so that can then be conflated with borderline. And also often gets conflated with just generalized anxiety, which is one of our favorite things to talk about. I gave a training in April, and one of the things I did was I actually did a deep dive back into the diagnostic criteria for generalized anxiety disorder. And I was reading it and I was like, it's really hard to actually get diagnosed with generalized anxiety disorder. You have to meet an enormous number of very specified criteria. And yet we just slap this diagnosis on people all of the time, and we don't get into the why are you anxious, right? Mm-hmm. Or so, for example, with borderline again, why do you struggle to have more than one friend? If you're autistic, you might struggle to understand friendships and relationships. That's actually part of the diagnostic criteria. And so having one friend that you're spending your time and energy on actually makes a lot of sense, especially if that friend is neurodivergent. But then they'll be, oh, she's borderline because she gets really obsessed with one person. And it's like, well, have you asked her understanding of friendships and relationships? And if that makes sense to her. So that's really where we see that differential breakdown.
And I'm sure there's so much more you can share. And I know that you're working on a diagnostic criteria to weed out and really hone in on what the actual diagnosis is. So the first time I met you, you were doing a training on EMDR.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And as a recipient of someone who does EMDR, I can't even tell the listeners enough how important it is, if you have ADHD, to have a practitioner who understands ADHD in their EMDR work. So tell us a little bit about that, please.
So yeah, when I first became a social worker, I graduated in 2019 and got trained in EMDR right away. So EMDR stands for eye movement, desensitization, and reprocessing. It's a mouthful. But what it is basically a therapy that is not a talk therapy. So you use eye movements or anything across the midline of the body to process things across the hemisphere of the brain. So instead of just sitting and talking, we're actually allowing your brain to do much deeper work in the session by actually having your eyes or doing tapping or some kind of bilateral movement as we're processing a certain topic or concept or experience. And so what that's based in is the understanding that in REM sleep, our eyes move back and forth really fast. And so that's processing the day. And so what has happened is that they've been able to put that into an awake state and allow people to process traumas that were too big for their brain to process during REM sleep. And so we have big T trauma and little T trauma. Big T trauma is like a car accident, an assault, like something like that, right? where, you know, it's this single instance, really, really intense and awful. But then there's small t trauma, which is what those of us with ADHD, we tend to have both. But small t trauma is the 110 negative things that children with ADHD hear about themselves in a day, right? Or small t trauma is your parents only talking to you about the negative things that you're doing, or getting a lot of times in trouble, or even missing pieces of conversations and feeling like a space cadet. Like, I cannot tell you the number of women that I work with who, you know, they're like, I feel like I'm just faking my way through life, or I feel like I've always just been one step behind, that odd one out feeling, right?
Mm-hmm.
And men experience it as well. But, and, you know, I think it's across the gender spectrum, but because we have less understanding of women with ADHD and less diagnosis and treatment, I see that a lot, especially in my women. And so what EMDR does is it allows us to process these experiences in a way that's actually going to fully heal them and replace the negative belief with a positive adaptive belief. Not I'm Superwoman, but, you know, I can do hard things and I am capable and functional and effective in my life. And so it's really, really transformative. And when we adjunct it with other ADHD treatments, so I'm a big believer in stimulant medication, fish oil, all of the evidence-based practices for ADHD treatment. Coaching is game-changing, right? I love ADHD coaching. I think it's just so helpful. And when somebody then it gets stuck in coaching or isn't ready for coaching, what do we do? And that's where EMDR for ADHD can really come in. Because if someone deeply believes that they're incapable of being on time, or I am a procrastinator, all of the coaching in the world isn't going to uproot that shame-based belief. And so EMDR can very quickly, with the understanding of ADHD and other forms of neurodivergence, can very quickly help people to work through those so they're more ready for coaching, their meds work better, they're able to actually access treatment more effectively.
So you said a lot there.
I did.
I want to break that down if that's okay with you.
Of course, please.
So there's the big T and the small t. And what I thought I heard you say, which I totally agree with, is that everyone with ADHD experiences trauma.
Yes, I actually believe that living with ADHD, especially in our current society, in the Western world, is intrinsically traumatic.
So even though the research says that only 80% of adults, everyone in your experience and in my personal experience working with people, have experienced trauma.
Yeah, everyone with ADHD has experienced, I think, some form. Now, it might not be the type of trauma that needs specialized trauma treatment, but we need to acknowledge that the world that we're in is not built for our brains.
Right. So it could be the small t.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Right. That's the first thing I wanted to break down for people listening. I think that's really important for everyone to hear. Another thing is, I understand the importance of EMDR, and it really does work in reprogramming your brain differently. I want to also just challenge something that you said about coaching versus EMDR.
Yeah, absolutely. Please.
So in working with thousands of people who, of course, come to coaching because they have shame, they have procrastination, in doing these small actions and, you know, changing the way that they think in a CBT-like way, or reframing the way that they think, they have walked away thinking differently and feeling differently.
1,000%. Yes.
So on what level would you say that it's not enough and then they need EMDR? Yeah.
So most people with ADHD will benefit from exactly what you do with your clients. So I was one of those clients. I didn't do EMDR for my ADHD. I did coaching and it worked really well. So I would say I don't really have a good estimate of this, but like most people who are diagnosed with ADHD can go through the coaching process successfully and change those beliefs, overcome their negative core beliefs. The people I'm talking about are the people who especially have acute childhood trauma or a complex PTSD diagnosis, or just have really bad attachment wounds. So we're looking at kind of like maybe a 20% of this population who they try to do the coaching work. They're showing up, they're doing the best they can, but they just keep coming back to this block, or they're too emotionally dysregulated or kind of bogged down by their PTSD symptoms to be able to engage in coaching in the first place.
Sure.
Again, like I said, I think 20%. It's not, and again, like you said, like, yes, coaching is amazing. It does change thought patterns. It's transformative. I went through it myself. Game changer, absolute game changer. But I do think that there are a subset of people for whom their trauma load is significant enough that I basically use the analogy of like, when you get diagnosed and treated for ADHD, imagine the giant doors of your prefrontal cortex, and the meds help to unlock them, and coaching and such helps to throw them open, and we move into the prefrontal cortex. What happens though if there's a whole bunch of boxes in front of that door? Yeah. And like I said, I don't think for most people there are, but for the people who there are a lot of boxes in front of that door, they can't even get to that door to open it because there's so much in front of it. And again, like, I'm a trauma therapist. And so the people I work with, you know, have stories that would curl your hair, like, and, you know, that would curdle your blood. Like, it's the really tough stuff that also goes along with an ADHD diagnosis, because we know that ADHD goes in families. We know, you know, a lot of those statistics and such. And so a lot of times we're looking at things that are outside of just the ADHD. Now, I do have some clients who come to me specifically for EMDR for ADHD. And a lot of times they're people who just are like, I just want to see what this does for me, right? Like they're going to do coaching at some point, but they're like, I just feel like I have some blocks. A lot of times they're very high IQ. They need something a little different than coaching in that first phase of treatment. And
totally understand.
You just happen to have that option. But yes, I would agree with you. Coaching is the way to go for the vast majority of people.
No, yeah. And there's no one size fits all solution, right?
And that drives me crazy when people say there is.
Yeah, you have to do this. You have to do this. I mean, you talk about the triage effect of medication, coaching, behavioral strategies, EMDR. So it's interesting because you and I have spoken about this. Just a little quick piece about me. Before I knew I had ADHD, I was doing talk therapy and I was getting more anxious every time I went to talk therapy. I was diagnosed with generalized anxiety disorder, and I felt like I was just reopening these wounds without any execution or reprogramming. And it was just talking about that anxiety more and more. And then I got on anti-anxiety medication, and that would like mask the anxiety a little bit. And then I got coached. I didn't even know what it was. It wasn't even specifically ADHD coaching, but for the first time ever, I understood how my brain worked. I understood my strengths, my weaknesses, and actually how to execute over a long period of time on big things intentionally. And that made me feel really confident about myself. So I was like, coaching is the thing. Yeah. And ironically, I became a coach. Yeah. Now, fast forward so I'm 6 years into it, but 5 years into it, I said, oh, okay. The execution's all there, but now I'm a mom, right? And now I'm a spouse, and there's some triggers going on that are definitely connected to my complex trauma from being bullied and rejected, and pretty much from the age of 8 to 35,
which is a lot. So
that's a lot of repeated trauma. So the coaching not only, but it got me so far, but now I'm like re-engaging in this trauma where I feel like I didn't really it wasn't as in the front of my mind.
Well,
before.
And I really do think that without ADHD treatment, it can be quite hard to do trauma work, right? And so that's really what I'm trying to bring to the EMDR field is we need to get people diagnosed and treated and, you know, into this community and then do EMDR with them so that they can have successful outcomes.
Yes. I don't think I would have been able to hold the space and believe in it before if I didn't understand my ADHD brain.
I think that's very true. I think that's a really, really great point.
Now, tell me a little bit, and for our listeners, how understanding ADHD, because you and I have spoken about like visualizing parts and things like that, what it means to understand ADHD when you're doing EMDR.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think that what's important to clarify is if you have ADHD and you're doing EMDR, that's totally okay. What I'm pioneering is very new in the field. And the EMDR community is only just now starting their conversation around neurodivergence. And so I'm really hoping to kind of throw open the door. So if you have had successful EMDR without a neurodivergent or ADHD informed therapist and it's been helpful, that's wonderful. Like that can happen. And I'm not saying that it can't. But what I think can really help is things like fidgeting in session. Or a really good example of this is actually when I was originally taught EMDR, I was taught 2 feet flat on the floor. Okay. Like that the client needs to have 2 feet fully flat on the floor. But about a year ago, when I started to see clients back in person, I started noticing that my clients did not have 2 feet flat on the floor. And I would coach them. I'd be like, oh, can you please put 2 feet flat on the floor? But then I started to ask myself, why am I doing that? Like, obviously my trainer, I loved my trainer. She was great. But I was like, let me see if it works the same if there's not 2 feet flat on the floor. Works exactly the same. And so I was realizing that, especially with ADHD, hypermobility, POTS, all these things that, affect our experience of our body, I want my client to be the most comfortable that they can be. So if being curled up like a pretzel in the chair in my office is the most comfortable for their nervous system during EMDR, I don't want to change that. So that's one very, very small example. Or fidgeting, right? So like my clients and I all fidget during session. It does not affect your impact processing. It does not affect or impact really anything. Sometimes I have my clients and I get up and do dancing and other forms of bilateral. And I've done this for long enough and tried enough different things to know that the quality of the processing is not affected. And so there's just these beliefs that sometimes can happen in EMDR therapy where we have to have 2 feet on the floor, we have to sit still, we have to really focus, or if the person gets distracted, that's so bad. It's not. My clients get distracted regularly and we go, oh, you have ADHD. Cool. Let's come back to target.
It reminds me when I was a special education teacher and the general education teacher said, you have to do all those things, but
that's
why?
Really good example. That's a really fantastic analogy. And again, not just to say that people with ADHD are, disabled in that sense that they can't do EMDR, but that they simply are. I love the bike, the fish riding a bike analogy, right? Why would we judge, or climbing a tree? Why would we judge a fish by how well it could ride a bike or climb a tree? Why can't we judge it by how well it swims, right? Yes. And I think that that's really what I'm trying to bring to EMDR for ADHD is to say, let's help our clients swim as opposed to trying to force them to ride a bike or climb a tree while still using the core modality. Bilateral stimulation works for trauma processing for brains with ADHD. It works. I've done thousands of sessions and I'm
a candidate.
I have hundreds and hundreds of people who can say this really helps, right? But there's these tweaks that we can make to it, just the traditional standard protocol that really increases effectiveness and also reduces the possibility of shaming our clients. So this is one of my biggest issues with traditional therapy these days is that I think, especially with a CBT or DBT lens, those are other frameworks, there's a lot of homework, there's a lot of using certain skills at times of distress.
That's exactly what I was just thinking.
When that doesn't happen, the client comes back and the therapist goes, well, how was being mindful this week? And they go, oh,
what is mindful?
To do it and I couldn't do it. And then they're like, well, that's bad. You're being resistant or you're failing therapy. No, they have ADHD. So I don't give my clients homework. We work our butts off in session. I mean, I tell them it's like doing a HIIT exercise routine in session, and they are often very tired, but I don't make them do homework outside of session. And I don't care if I say, oh, why don't you just try to think about this week? If they come back and they never had a thought about it, I don't care. I tell them I'm not your mom. I'm not your teacher. I'm here to help you heal. So.
Yeah. And I can attest because I've seen you hold these sessions before that you really make impact within the session.
Yeah.
And strongly in ways that are new ways, getting memories out of your dreams even. It's pretty amazing the work that you do.
Thank you.
And I love, just in our friendship, all the things that you shared with me about how you make it ADHD friendly. If you incorporate interfamily systems, right?
Yeah,
and you talk about the internal family systems, thank you. And you look at the parts of your body and you dress them up, it gives the ADHD brain more of a visual.
I actually have a whole section in my book that I'm eventually going to publish of redeeming the ADHD imagination, because that's one tool that I think is so powerful for EMDR is a really robust imagination. But how many of us were shamed for our imaginations as children or even young adults, right? ADHD kiddos and ADHD adults often have very robust imaginations, but we're also often criticized and shamed and maligned for our imaginative creativity. And so I think that we in EMDR can really help people to reconnect positively with their imagination and really have a very cool experience of actually using it to help them overcome symptoms and overcome trauma. And that's internal family systems is a way of imagining our parts of ourselves. And so that can really, really help people with ADHD to gain a little bit more internal control about like who's in the driver's seat right now. How old do I feel in this situation? I also have really started doing a lot more with introducing my ADHD clients to their prefrontal cortex. So
as
once
a part.
people are in meds, as a part, and it's like an executive part. So we like go to the prefrontal cortex and they're met by this like executive character. And then we go around and we show them all these different departments in their brain. So the time management department, the short-term memory department, the, doing things on time department, like all these different departments. And so then when they need to go and do something that's usually hard for an ADHD brain, they can literally imagine going into that department and accessing that executive function. So it's pretty fun. Yeah.
Wow. That's really cool.
Mm-hmm.
And it's similar to what Richard Schwartz or previous people have talked about, that all of our parts, like it's the sum of our parts, right? So our executive functions work together. Mm-hmm. Yes, we can pull out, okay, we have a weakness in this area, but it's still working together, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yep. Mm-hmm.
Cool. What would be like the one thing that you would want to leave our audience with if they are trying to figure out, I know this is a very broad question, but like they just got diagnosed with ADHD, like what do they do?
What do they do?
Where do they go?
Sure. I'm going to give a shameless plug to Attitude Magazine. Like Attitude Magazine is incredible. Just go hang out on their website, do their webinars. ADA is also a great resource, the Adults with Attention Deficit Disorder Association. You could also reach out for like a consult or coaching call with Brooke or with, there's all kinds of coaches out there. ADHD Center has a bunch of them, but really starting with the psychoeducation piece. So the How to ADHD YouTube channel, there's some really great Thomas Brown and Russell Barkley talks out there. So really understanding the ADHD brain, understanding what it does, working with a doctor or specialist to figure out medication and supplements, and sleep is a huge cornerstone. So kind of starting there, getting your team together, and then really realizing that there's hope, that you are not intrinsically flawed, that you do not have a moral failing or a moral character flaw. And this is what I do with my clients all day, every day, is I go from people believing that they are, morally objectionable because they're running late or they're morally failing, to saying it's not a moral failure. It's an executive function problem that's based in a brain-based disorder.
Yeah.
So starting to give yourself that grace, and especially women, to realize how much they're using shame to motivate, and then to get help, whether it be a therapist or a coach or a group, whatever it may be, whatever you can do to start to move from shame to hope, and move from using shame to motivate to using your prefrontal cortex and executive function, and just realizing like you're not alone. I have ADHD. I was diagnosed 12 years ago. I feel like ADHD only really bothers me about 10% of the time. And I know exactly what to do when that happens. And so I'm not saying that, everyone can always experience that, but there is a lot of hope and there's a lot of resources. There's an old story that I love in kind of like the Chad ADA ACO circles, which is that there was a lawyer who finally got diagnosed with ADHD, but he didn't have any money because he couldn't get his billing together. And he went online and did all of the free stuff that was out there and completely turned his business around just with the free resources. And he was able to like use those things to get himself help. So I'm not saying not to invest in coaching and stuff, but like if you don't have enough money right now, realize that there is a lot out there that can at least start that journey for you. And also a lot of us run groups. A lot of us, have low fee options. Like it's really important to realize that there's hope no matter where you're at.
Oh, Noelle, I love that. Thank you so much. And for those of you who are wondering if you should be working with Noelle, I'm telling you, she made a huge difference in just like one meeting with her as a friend. There's just so many people claiming out there that they're ADHD experts. Noelle's not claiming she's an ADHD expert, but she is. She understands the neuroscience. She understands the brain. She understands ADHD. She understands how to help people. She's gold. So, Noelle, thank you so much for being on Successful with ADHD.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me. It's been great fun.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Successful with ADHD. I hope it helps you on your journey. And if you need any additional support for you or a loved one with ADHD, feel free to reach out to us at coachingwithbrooke.com and all social media platforms at Coaching with Brooke. And remember, it's Brooke with an E. Thanks again for listening. See you next time.